Hey folks, welcome to week 2 of DMD 105 Digital Design Foundations. How is everybody? Hope you're doing well. All right, so let's hop on over to our modules and see what we're doing for week 2 here. So last week, week 1, our first week of school, we just got introduced not only to the class and the class structure, but also to the Adobe Creative Cloud workflow and how things generally function in using the Adobe software. By now, everybody has their Adobe accounts up and running and has hopefully been tooling around and practicing with Photoshop, just getting a little familiar with it. And we did some simple demonstrations of how the pixel-based software works. This week, let's take a look at the week 2 module. This week we are all about layer basics in Photoshop. Now, I introduced you briefly to the layers palette last time, but we're going to get really in depth with it this week because the layers palette is one of the most important tools in Photoshop that really makes using Photoshop actually possible in a really advanced kind of way. So we have to know the layers palette really well. So that's our main goal this week, is going over that. Our consumables this week are these 2 videos here. As promised, this class is not just about learning software. We are going to be covering some of the basics of visual design. And so the first area that we're going to be talking about is layout and composition. Our first in-class assignment, a scene from Venice, which we're going to tackle a little later this week, is going to rely on the concept of layout and composition. And so your consumable is this video right here, all about that. Be sure to watch that in advance of Wednesday. The other video here is sort of a beginning tutorial of Photoshop. It's going to cover some of the basics. Now you're probably thinking, well, wait a minute, aren't you covering some of the basics? Yes, of course I am. But because Photoshop is such a vast program, it always helps to get a couple of different perspectives. What I usually tell people is listen to and practice with what I show you in class. Look at some of these tutorial videos that I give you, maybe go find some of your own tutorial videos, and then spend as much time as you can just practicing in Photoshop and just really messing around with it and playing, because making time for play and just getting to know the software is really important. And between those 3 avenues of instruction and exploration, you'll really get to know the software. So this video on top of what I'm showing you and your own playing around will be helpful. Okay, like I said, later in the week we're going to tackle our first in-class exercise called A Scene from Venice. You can get all the files you need from that by clicking here. It will take you to the Files menu in Canvas, and just simply go down to the Week 2 folder. And you'll see here, there it is, A Scene from Venice. You can download this entire folder just by hitting download. And in that folder, you're going to find all these things here. This is what we need to do this in-class exercise. So you can sort of download that in advance of Wednesday and jump ahead so that you'll have it ready to go. Okay. And then also for this week, let's go back over here. Also for this week, we're going to have some homework at the end of the week to get ready for our first quiz next week. Now, the first quiz is all about layers, so let's get to it so we can get to know layers so you can do well on the quiz and know layers. All right, so let's hop over to Photoshop. Okay, so here we are in Photoshop, and I have a few things to show you. This is going to be just sort of a basic demonstration of the concept of how layers work. Now, as you probably remember, what we're looking at here in Photoshop is nothingness, right? This gray and white grid pattern represents just endless amounts of air. I talked about this already in class. And so this just means it's transparent. There's nothing here. And so the way that layers work in Photoshop is that it allows you to put different pieces of images, almost as if you were sort of ripping up photographs from a magazine and making a collage, and then overlapping them so that some of them are in front of others and some of them are behind others using layer techniques. Now, this whole technique actually comes from the history of traditional cell animation. If you're familiar at all with cell animation, and it's not really the way animation is done anymore, animation is done digitally these days, but originally animation was all hand painted. It was all done by hand. And so if you imagine like an old Bugs Bunny cartoon or an old Mickey Mouse cartoon, there was a background. So let's look at the Roadrunner, for example, right? You guys know the Roadrunner? Beep, beep. And so there might be a background painting of like the Arizona desert, right, with all the buttes and the rocks and everything. That's called a matte painting, and that would be done in the very back layer. So, for example, if I turn on the back layer here, it's just sort of a black background. So that's sort of our matte painting. It's our background, right? And then some characters would be introduced into the animation as sort of cutouts, right? And so you could have the Roadrunner or the Coyote or Bugs Bunny or whatever, and then they get sort of dropped in as cutouts. So here we have these two guys here. They come in a different layer, right? And so, and if you're not familiar, this here is Rosita and Elmo from Sesame Street, right? And then you could have another character come in on a different layer, and so we'll turn that on, and then you've got this sort of cute kid here in the background. And then they can add some effects, like you'll notice that the table has shadows already, or rather reflections already on it for Rosita and for Elmo, but because this kid in the background isn't really there, we had to make a shadow for her. So there you go, she gets her own shadow there. And this is all in layers. And so when you're all done, you have a scene that looks like it's all together, but it's really not. It's just in a bunch of layers. And so we can take them away layer by layer by layer until you're just back to nothingness, to air, to transparency. And that's how old cell animation would work. And that's basically the premise of the layers palette in Photoshop. So I'm going to pick up the layers palette here and pull it away. And we're going to take a closer look at what the layers palette involves with this example. So for one thing here, you'll see that the layers palette puts each layer in a stack. And as I explained before, the layer that's at the top is closest to us in space. In this case, it's this sort of really fuzzy shadow that I built, or rather reflection. And then the layer that's behind that is this one, and then the layer that's right behind that is this one, and then the layer that's behind that is this one, and so on and so forth till you have your scene. Now you can reorder them. I could put a layer that's almost at the bottom and bring it all the way to the top by simply picking it up and dragging it. And you see that little blue line? That shows you what order you are in and where you're dragging it. So if I let it go with the mouse, boom, it now goes in front. So now the picture of the kid is in front, right? And if I even grab the black background and just drag that all the way to the front, well, now that's in front. Of course, now I can't see anything because everything's behind it, but you get the idea. So the order in which you are sort of reshuffling these layers is no different than really having a stack of pieces of paper and you're just reordering them in terms of what's on top and what's not. The only difference is that unlike a piece of paper that's solid, these are basically cutouts. So let's take a look at one of the cutouts. And this is basically the premise of what's called compositing. Now we're going to get into compositing more in depth a little bit later. I'll show you some examples in a little bit, and we're going to be making our first composite with the Scene from Venice exercise. But the idea of compositing is that you have a bunch of cutout photographs that you then reassemble using layers in a particular order. Now you might notice that this particular photo of this kid is not really cut out all that cleanly, right? I mean, sure, the shirt is cut out nice and neat, right? This was cut out in a way that works nicely. But around the head is really rough. Literally what happened here is somebody took the eraser tool, which we're going to learn about in a minute, and just literally scrubbed around the person's head and erased away the background. So you're probably thinking, well, that seems sloppy. That's not going to produce a good result. But what the person knew who was cutting this out was that it was going on a black background, and the kid's hair is mostly black, so that when you turn on the black background, it just blends together. And so it didn't have to be super neat in the first place to look convincing. And so compositing generally requires really neat and accurate selections. And we're going to start with the eraser tool, which was done here. And we'll get into some more detailed selection tools, which we demonstrated a little bit in class last time. So in general, your selection should be really neat and clean, but sometimes they don't have to be. So let's look at these cutouts of the two puppets here, of Rosita and Elmo, right? So those you can see are cut out a little more neatly, right? Whoever went in did a nice job of cleaning it up. And of course, they're both furry characters, so you really got to get in there and get the detail. But even in some spots, you can see it might be a little sloppy. But again, when you put a black background behind it, it all kind of blends together, so it's not so bad. So layers allows us to do that. If we didn't have layers in Photoshop, then you couldn't merge together these different photographs. And furthermore, special effects, like adding this additional reflection at the bottom here, wouldn't be able to overlay it. Now you're probably wondering, well, how is that reflection created in a way that is semi-transparent? You can sort of see through it here. And that's because since Photoshop handles transparency, remember this grid means it's just air, right? It's nothing. Then that means each of your objects can become transparent. What do I mean by that? Well, let's demonstrate that here. So I'm going to just leave this layer on, and as you're going through layers, you'll notice that the layer that is active is highlighted in gray. So if I click on a layer, even if it's not visible, even if the eyeballs are not turned on, that means that layer is active. What an active layer means is that that's the layer that if I do something else, something will happen to that layer. So in doing so, let's take a look at this one layer. So I made sure that I highlighted this layer so that it's active, the layer of the kid, and the eyeball is turned on so I can see her, and then if I shut it off, I can't see her. Okay. So now it's active. Now, what can I do to it? Well, the layers palette, aside from giving you a place to organize and stack your layers like we had just been doing, it also gives you some tools up here at the top. Now, the very top row of the layers palette are all about organization tools for sort of finding your different layers. Now, this doesn't do us a lot of good when we only have 4 layers like we do here. But as I explained earlier, in the previous class, some projects you have dozens and dozens of layers, and so being able to search through them based on different attributes like pixels or adjustments or type layers, etc., will make your life easier. So we're not going to use that right now, but you will get to that when we get to more complex projects. Now the next row down is what's called blending modes and opacity. We're going to deal with blending modes a little bit later. You can use the pull-down menu and read through them. If you are familiar with darkroom photography at all, or just photography in general, you might recognize some of these terms because these are photographic adjustment terms that allow for transparency to be mixed with pixels and create different sort of effects. We'll learn about that later. Over here, though, on the right, we have opacity. Now, this is an opacity slider, meaning that if you click it down, you've got a little slider adjustment here. And right now, you'll see it's set at 100%. Well, if something is opaque, that means that you can't see through it. The opposite of opaque is transparent. So opacity and transparency are opposite sides of the same coin. So if something is not opaque, it is therefore transparent. And if it is transparent, you can see through it. So with the opacity slider set to 100, this layer is completely solid, right? But as I start moving the slider down, watch what happens. She becomes more and more see-through. She is transparent and eventually becoming a ghost and then completely going away. So what it does is it adds transparency to the pixels. It makes them more or less see-through. Now that comes in handy when you're trying to blend things effectively. So back to our layer with the 2 puppets in the table. Again, there were reflections for the 2 puppets, but no reflection for the girl because she didn't actually exist. So we had to take a little cutout of her shirt and make it into the reflection. But you'll notice up here in opacity that it's set at 28% opacity. And we even added a blending mode to it called overlay, which it makes it look like it's more of a reflection and therefore embedded into the tabletop, which is kind of neat. Now, of course, if I were to get rid of the blending mode, just make it normal, and bring the opacity all the way up, whoop, then you can see that there's the cutout that we used, right? It's just a reverse flip of her shirt. Doesn't look very nice here. It looks kind of rough and really poorly done, actually. But as soon as you go ahead and adjust the opacity back to where it was, back to around 28, and then fix the blending mode to overlay, and then put the table under it, well, it looks like a pretty convincing reflection. So that's another way to use layers, is by adjusting the transparency and the opacity of the pixels using both blending modes and the opacity slider. Okay, next we're going to skip over the next row for the moment, and we're going to go down and look at the layers themselves. As we went over in class, the eyeballs turn the visibility on and off. Now remember, this is not the same as transparency. You're just temporarily shutting it off so that you can get it out of the way, so you can see other things underneath. when you click on each layer, like I said, they become active. Now, you want to name your layers. You'll notice none of these are named, right? They just say layer 1 or layer 1 copy or layer 0. Pretty useless names, really. These are names that Photoshop gives the layers automatically. You need to name them, and there's a couple ways to do that. Normally, I just like to double click on the name, and you'll see it becomes an editable text field. So now I can name this background, right? Because that's my background color. So just type in the name, hit return on your keyboard. And then this one here, we're just going to name girl because it's a photo of a little girl. So we'll go from there. And then we'll just call this Muppets because they are Muppets. And this one here is a reflection, so we'll call it reflection. Now, there's really no hard and fast rules about what to name your layers, but you should name them something that you will recognize. Because again, when you get into more complex Photoshop projects that have dozens and dozens of layers, you're going to want to know what things are. These little thumbnails are useful, but it's a lot faster if you know the names. Okay, next, back up above that, there was that one row that we skipped over. This is the lock row, and this allows you to lock your layers certain ways. What do I mean by locking? Well, for example, without the layers locked, I can at any time grab the move tool from the toolbar here and just simply pick up a layer and move it around. So I can move her wherever I want. And that's both good and bad, right? It's good because it gives me options, but it's bad because what if I had her exactly where I wanted her and now I just messed it up and I can't remember where the heck she was. So to do that, to make sure that she doesn't go anywhere, you want to lock that layer down, right? And so there's different ways to lock it. You'll notice that there are different locking functions. You can lock all the transparent pixels, which means anything that's transparent around that layer, which would be all the area out here, outside of the photo of the girl, means I can't make any changes to them. If I were to lock the second button, which is to lock the image pixels, that means I can make changes out here, but I can't make changes in here. Those would lock down. You can lock just its ability to move, which is the lock position button, which if I do that, click that, you'll see a little lock icon pops up. I can't move her anymore, but I could do other things to it. I could paint over it, etc. In fact, if I try to move it, look, I get a warning that says you can't move it, it's locked. And you can lock its scalability, whether or not you can resize it. Now, all of these different types of locks are fabulous, but I have found in practice it is easier just to use the very last one, which is just the lock all button. It just locks the whole thing down in place. I can't move it, I can't resize it, I can't do anything to it. That's usually the safest bet. Okay, so you can lock layers. The other thing you can do with layers is you can group them together. Now, if you click one layer and it highlights gray, that's active. But now if I hold down the Shift key on my keyboard while I'm clicking, I can click the next layer. Now I have 2 layers active. And then if I pick up a third layer, I can click on that. Now I have 3 layers active. Now you'll notice I did not click the background layer. So now with the Move tool, now I can pick these up and move them together in unison. And they will stay in relation to each other because they are all selected. But now that's only because I selected them, which is great temporarily, but what if I want them permanently to be linked, right? What if I want the Muppets, the reflection, and the girl to always be linked together? Well, all of the palettes in Photoshop handle what's called a contextual menu, which is just your right-click menu. So if I were to right-click anywhere in there, I get a bunch of options, right? Now, many of these are grayed out because they don't relate to what we have here, but you can see that one of the things you can do is link layers. So if I hit link layers, you'll see that like a little chain icon between the 3 of them. And now, even if I only have one of those layers chosen, you'll see that the chains pop back up again, and now if I move it, they all stay permanently linked together. So this keeps their sort of relational position stuck together, which is great once you've gone through the trouble of linking them together. Okay, so that's sort of layer basics for right now. We'll get more into it in class. Let's look at some examples of compositing. Now, this is a composite, right? This is a pretty simple composite of just these 4 images, but I'm going to show you some examples of more complex composites. So we have this here. Let me put the layers palette back where it belongs. So this is a composite, right? This is a graphic that was done for Lonely Planet, the travel website. And this is a composite of multiple photographs. There's the green paper in the background. There's the map. There's the text on top, right? So right there we have 3 images. Then we have the image of the woman with the luggage, the Eiffel Tower, and the Paris postcard. Now, there's even more, right? Because each of these photo corners are actually separate objects. The photo paper that these images are sitting on, those are separate objects. And of course, the Lonely Planet logo. So this is made up of many more images than you probably think it was, all to put together to be made this really cool graphic. Now, in this type of composite, you're not trying to fool anybody into thinking that this is reality, but it's more of an artistic representation of something. Whereas this one here, we're trying to sort of fool people into thinking that this was an actual photo with all of these characters put together, right? All of these people put together. But here it's more of an artistic interpretation. Here's another example, right? So this is actually 4 different photographs. It's the pig, actually 5 different photographs. It's the pig, it's the hot air balloon, it's the rope, it's the sky, and then these extra puffy clouds in the middle ground here. So those all come together composited to make one image. Now again, you're not fooling anybody. We know a giant pig is not being carried through the air by a hot air balloon. As cool as that would be, it's not real. But it's an artistic interpretation, right? And so this is a great example of a composite that was done using layers. Same thing with this. This is another one on the same pigs theme. Right? This is made up of a variety of different images. You've got 3 pigs, you've got a bubble, you get wings, you get 2 different sky photos glued together. You've got a rocket, you've got some flames and some smoke, you got a belt. So again, all put together in a way that's interesting. Now, one thing to pay attention to with these is how they're laid out. So they're not just an example of compositing, but there are also choices made about where each item is within the shape of the format, or within the shape of the page, as it were. Keep that in mind as you watch the video about layout. Now here's another one that's a composite for a graphic purpose. This is the Toll House chocolate chip cookie recipe that we all know and love so much. But this shows different components of the recipe, and these are not meant to be in realistic scale, right? You know, the cup of brown sugar is not realistically sized against the giant chocolate chip cookie in the corner, and so on and so forth. But this is just meant to show the different pieces of the ingredients in an artistic fashion, as well as some typography for the actual recipe. All right, and last example. This is an insert for a music CD with some graphics for a band. And again, this is a composite with a bunch of different photographs, as well as typography, standard photos, as well as composited photos, all put together to make this graphic. Okay, so none of these things, compositing in general, whether it be something like this or that or that or whatever, none of these would be possible without the layers palette. All right, so practice with the layers palette, mess around with it, and when we get back together, we are going to go over a scene from Venice, where we're going to use the eraser tool to do our very first composite image and use the layers palette to put together some photos into a new graphic. All right, you guys go ahead and keep practicing. I will see you soon, and have a great day.